Hi, my name is Jody Harris. I'm a researcher at the World Vegetable Centre. But when I did this research, I was at the Institute of Development Studies with the team shown here. So in the paper I'm going to present today, we undertook a scoping review of available literature to understand how ANH research is addressing issues of inequity and inequality in order to pinpoint gaps in knowledge that might be limiting action to leave no one behind in those particular areas of social development. So the Sustainable Development Goals contain targets to improve agriculture, nutrition and health, and also to improve equality among different groups. So leaving no one behind implies a focus on equal outcomes, but also equitable processes in achieving development indicators. So what are equity and equality? So this famous picture shows the essential difference between equity and equality. So equality on the left focuses on outcome or the sameness of a final distribution, whereas equity focuses more on process or the fairness of a just distribution. So equity and equality aren't the same, but they're not mutually exclusive. So one chooses to focus on outcome and the other on process very broadly. And a key concept that underpins inequity and inequality is marginalization. And we know that a lot of ANH research concerns itself with different aspects of marginalization. So for instance, the disempowerment of women or disparities in income. But in previous work, we thought we were seeing that food and nutrition research so far has only a partial treatment of equity and equality issues. So other axes of marginalization, things like age, ethnicity, race, caste, disability, sexuality, other issues seem to come up far less often in the ANH literature when we were looking at sort of who had these different outcomes. And then the interactions between these different aspects of marginalization came up even less often. And then the structural determinants of marginalization that surrounded these ideas of social position were coming up even less. Things like inequitable access to basic services and resources, political redressal, things like power relations and social norms and ideas of injustice. So there was much less focus on equitable processes. So this framework of nutrition equity explains those processes, and you can read more about this in the 2020 Global Nutrition Report, which we wrote this year, and which this year focused explicitly on nutrition equity. So for this paper that I'm presenting today, we wanted to look at the literature and see the full range of ANH work on inequity and inequality. So we used the ideas from this framework to search for and classify papers in a scoping review. So scoping reviews are a relatively rapid form of review. They aim to systematically gather and map the key concepts and sources underpinning a particular area of research, and to identify knowledge gaps that a research field like ours might then choose to address in future work. But it doesn't necessarily look to assess the quality of that research or to draw sort of further inference from it. So it maps what's there. So we searched 3 databases, you can see at the top here, and after screening almost 20,000 results, we came up with 243 papers which we coded and mapped for this review. So I'm going to present just some highlights from the review for lack of time, but if you find the slides online, there are further slides at the end with more analyses, and there's actually a longer webinar on the A4NH YouTube site if you want the long version. So we explicitly looked for papers between 2008 and 2019 because a lot happened in ANH during those years. And between the review start and end dates, the number of studies looking at any aspect of equity in ANH research increased quite steadily from fewer than 10 papers in 2008 to over 45 in 2018. But those numbers obviously are a fraction of the total number of studies undertaken in the ANH research space over that time. So equity in general is just not a highly studied issue in ANH research. And you can see here then the equity concepts that we mapped the papers to, that list on the left. And we found that within equity, a majority of papers looked at capital and resources, so things like poverty. They looked at gender, and they looked at structural determinants and age. But very fewer looked at explicitly at equity without specifying the pathway, and very few looked at things like disability or ethnicity, and only 2 looked at the sort of intersection between some of those different aspects of marginalisation. So this is the figure that really brings it all together and shows the density of research in terms of the deepness of the colour, covering the different equity topics listed at the bottom in each of the ANH topics listed around the top. So I'm not going to go into this now. I'm going to talk more about this in the live session at the conference. So in summarising the different levels of equity that we saw in these papers, of all of those different aspects of equity mapped according to our conceptual framework, a majority of papers looked at unequal outcomes stratified by some of those personal characteristics, gender, poverty, things like that. So 185 of the papers looked at those. And then a significant number looked at social position or material circumstances making up human capital and resources. So 160 papers looked at that. And then a smaller number of papers looked at the structural determinants of inequity, things like social norms and values, and we had 51 papers on that. So in summary, most papers looked at what the inequity problem is. Fewer looked at how that inequity is shaped, and fewer still looked at why that inequity exists in the first place. So given the number of studies now being undertaken in the ANH research space overall over the past decade, the total number found to have explicitly incorporated equity within the core analysis of the paper and clearly enough that it could be identified by us as focusing on equity issues really is tiny. So it's heartening that the number is clearly increasing over time as we increase focus on issues of equity. But looking at the particular aspects of equity covered in the literature, the same aspects remain the least studied, including ethnicity, disability, age, and intersectionality of those issues, and especially the sort of underlying and structural determinants of inequity. So given the role that inequity plays in holding back progress on a whole range of outcomes that we're all interested in, understanding and addressing it at those multiple levels really should be encouraged as quite a fundamental aspect of most future ANH research. So I'll be very happy to talk about the limitations of this work in Q&A and give any more detail on the methods and findings, and I'll focus on talking about next steps. So I will see you there.